The wind had a voice, and tonight it spoke of damnation. It was a high, thin scream that scraped across the plains of Wyoming, a sound that promised to strip the flesh from any living thing foolish enough to stand against it. Snow did not fall from the sky. It was driven sideways, a blinding white wall that erased the horizon and turned the world into a churning chaos of gray and white. The year was 1888, and winter had come not as a season, but as a judgment. Evelyn felt the cold in her teeth. It was a deep, internal ache that had settled in her marrow, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm. She was a ghost on a dying horse, a wraith wrapped in a wool cloak that offered no more protection than a shroud. The mare, Bess, trembled beneath her, each step a hesitant prayer against the ice, its breath plumed in ragged, freezing clouds, a rhythm of exhaustion that matched the frantic beating of Evelyn's own heart. She had been riding for 2 days, fleeing the small, suffocating town of Ash Hollow, fleeing a life that had become a cage with walls of whispers and bars of gold. The wind howled louder, and with it came the memories. They were sharper than the ice crystals that stung her cheeks, colder than the snow that had worked its way into her worn leather boots. She saw her husband's face, not as it was when he had first courted her with hollow promises, but as it had been last week. Arthur Monroe, a merchant of considerable standing, a man whose hands were soft from counting money and hard when they found her arm. He stood before the fireplace in their parlor, the flames casting shadows that made his thin lips seem crueler, his pale eyes emptier. "You are my wife," he had said, his voice as dry as old paper. "Your purpose is to reflect my station, not to have opinions, not to read those damnable books that fill your head with nonsense. Your world is this house." She remembered the weight of his hand on her shoulder, a gesture not of affection but of ownership. It was the same weight she felt when she walked through Ash Hollow. The women, gathered in a tight flock outside the general store, would fall silent as she passed. Their eyes, like the eyes of crows, would follow her, their whispers a rustle of dry leaves in her wake. Poor thing, one might say, just loud enough for the wind to carry it, married to a man like that. But their pity was laced with a strange, sharp satisfaction. She was a curiosity, a tragedy they could observe from the safety of their own acceptable lives. They saw the fine dresses Arthur bought her, but not the bruises they sometimes concealed. They saw the grand house, but not the silence that filled its rooms. Evelyn had tried. She had tried to be the woman he wanted, the woman the town expected. She had poured tea, arranged flowers, and smiled until her face ached. But inside, a wild, secret thing had begun to pace. It was a yearning for something she could not name, a desire for a life where her own thoughts were not a transgression. It was the simple, profound desire to breathe air that was not heavy with judgment. The final night, it had not been one grand act of cruelty that had broken her, but a small one. He had found her sketching in a small notebook, a charcoal drawing of the mountains she could see from her window. He did not yell. He simply took the book, tore the page from its binding, and dropped it into the fire. He watched it curl into black ash, then looked at her. "Idle hands," he'd said, and the quiet finality in his voice was worse than any shout. "We will find you more suitable occupations." That was when she knew. She could not wait for him to break her spirit completely. She had taken what little money she had saved, the mare he despised as a needless expense, and fled into the coming storm, praying the snow would cover her tracks. Now, that same snow was threatening to become her grave. Bess stumbled, her legs giving way with a weary groan. The horse went down, not with a crash, but a slow, surrendering slump into a deep drift. Evelyn was thrown clear, landing in a soft, cold embrace that stole the breath from her lungs. For a moment, she lay there, the world a dizzying swirl of white. The wind screamed in her ears, a lullaby of oblivion. "Get up, Bess," she whispered, her words lost to the gale. The mare did not move. Its dark eyes were half closed, its body a dark shape already being consumed by the storm. A terrible, final stillness had claimed it. Evelyn was alone. She pushed herself to her knees, then to her feet. The cold was a physical force, pushing her down, stealing her strength. She took one step, then another, walking toward nothing, chasing a half-remembered direction. The memory of her son's laughter, a ghost sound from a life before Arthur, from a time when she was just a girl with foolish dreams, echoed in her mind. It was a cruel trick of the wind. She stumbled again, her hands sinking deep into the snow. It was like sinking into a featherbed, soft and inviting. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the cold take her, to finally be warm in a way she had not been for years. She whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for it to be quick. Darkness began to gather at the edges of her vision, a welcome curtain falling on a poorly staged play. Cole Carson saw the flicker of movement through the blinding snow, a smudge of darkness where there should only be white. He had been pushing his way back from the lean-to where he kept his horse, the wind trying to tear the sack of oats from his grasp. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face weathered by sun and wind into a mask of stoic indifference. The war had burned away anything soft in him years ago, and the frontier had chipped away the rest. He lived alone because he preferred the company of silence to the lies of men. At first, he thought it was a wolf, or perhaps a pronghorn that had lost its way. But the shape was wrong. He squinted, pulling the brim of his hat down against the stinging ice. It was a horse, down in the snow, and beside it, another shape, smaller, struggling, a person. A curse, low and rough, left his lips. Only a fool or someone in a desperate hurry would be out in a storm like this. He secured the lean-to door, dropped the oats inside his cabin, and grabbed a coil of rope from a hook by the door. He did not think. He acted. It was a habit learned in places where hesitation meant death. The wind fought him every step of the way. By the time he reached the fallen horse, it was already half covered in a drift. The person beside it was on their knees, head bowed, a small, dark shape of surrender. He saw the thinness of the cloak, the lack of proper winter gear, and his jaw tightened. This was not a traveler who had been caught by a sudden storm. This was someone running. He touched the person's shoulder. They did not respond. He bent down, turning them over. It was a woman. Her face was pale as marble, her lips a faint, bluish color. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. Her eyes were closed, but a faint flutter beneath the lids told him she was still alive. He checked the horse. Its neck was cold, its body already stiffening. There was nothing to be done for it. Without a word, he worked the rope under the woman's arms, across her back. He could have carried her, but the snow was deep and treacherous, and he needed his hands free to keep his balance. He pulled her up, her body a dead weight against him. He began the slow, grueling process of dragging her back toward the faint, golden light of his cabin window. The wind shrieked its disapproval, trying to pull her from his grasp, but Cole leaned into it, his boots sinking deep, his muscles straining. He was a man against the storm, and for this one small life, he would not lose. He hauled her inside, slamming the door against the raging winter. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, her body limp and cold. For a long moment, he just stood over her, breathing heavily, his own breath fogging in the chilled air of the room. The cabin was small, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a cot in the corner, and shelves holding the bare necessities of a solitary life. It was a fortress against the world, and he had just brought the world inside. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared to life, casting flickering orange light across the room. He stripped off her frozen cloak and sodden dress, his movements impersonal, his focus entirely on the task of saving her. Her skin was so cold it felt like stone. He found a long wool shirt of his own and pulled it over her head, the garment swallowing her small frame. Then he wrapped her in every blanket he owned, piling them on top of her until she was just a mound on the floor. He spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended vigilance. The storm did not relent. It shook the small cabin, rattled the window pane, and moaned in the chimney. Cole sat in his chair by the fire, cleaning his rifle, sharpening his knife, drinking black coffee, and listening. He listened to the storm outside and to the woman's breathing inside. It was shallow at first, punctuated by violent shivers that shook her entire body. She began to mutter, her voice a fragile thread of sound in the roaring silence. The words were tangled, born of fever and fear. "Let me go," she would whisper, her hands clenching the blankets. So cold. No more. Freedom. He heard her say the name Arthur once, the name spoken like a curse. He did not understand the pieces of her story, but he understood the shape of it. It was the shape of a cage and of a desperate flight. He saw the faint, discolored marks on her wrists, old bruises that had faded but not disappeared, and he felt a cold, familiar anger settle in his gut. He brewed broth from the last of his salted beef and forced it between her lips when she was still enough. He bathed her face with a damp rag when the fever heated her skin. He did not sleep, save for short, fitful snatches in his chair. Her presence filled the small space, a disruption to the deep, settled quiet of his life. He was a man who had forgotten the sound of another person's breathing in the night, and now it was the only sound that mattered. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Her breathing deepened, becoming slow and steady. The shivering stopped. Cole stood by the window, watching the snow that was still falling. Though the wind had finally quieted, the world outside was buried, pristine and unforgiving. It was a clean slate, a world erased. He wondered if that was what she'd been looking for. When her eyes finally opened, they were the color of a stormy sky, a deep and wary gray. She stared at the log ceiling of the cabin, her brow furrowed in confusion. Her gaze traveled slowly around the room, taking in the stone hearth, the rifle mounted on the wall, the shelves of tins and jars. Finally, her eyes landed on him. He was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee held in his scarred hands. He did not speak, merely watched her, his expression unreadable. Fear, sharp and immediate, flooded her eyes. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back with a soft groan. "Easy now," Cole said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "You've been sleeping for a while." "Where am I?" she asked, her own voice a hoarse whisper. She clutched the blankets to her chin, her knuckles white. "My cabin. I found you in the snow." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. The storm's still on. Nowhere to go. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to piece together the fractured memories. The falling horse, the suffocating cold, the darkness. And then, nothing. Until now. She was in a stranger's cabin, wearing a man's shirt that smelled of wood smoke and pine. He had seen her. He had undressed her. A familiar shame, hot and bitter, rose in her throat. This was how it always was with men. They saved you only to own you. "Thank you for your help," she said, her tone stiff with pride. "I will be on my way as soon as the weather clears." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Suit yourself." He offered no comforting words, no reassurances. His silence was as vast and unnerving as the landscape outside. The tension in the small room grew thick and heavy. It was a clash of her ingrained suspicion and her unwilling gratitude. She owed this quiet, hard-faced man her life, and the knowledge felt like a debt she could never repay, another chain to replace the ones she had just broken. For his part, Cole felt the return of a loneliness he had not realized he was carrying. For 3 days, The cabin had been full of purpose. Now, it was just a small room holding two broken people. He saw the fear in her, the pride that served as armor, and he recognized it. It was the same armor he wore every day. He looked away from her, out the small window at the endless expanse of white. The snow had buried everything, the fences, the dead pines, the tracks of animals. It was a world made silent and cruel and vast. He felt a kinship with it. It was an honest cruelty, a wilderness that made no promises it could not keep. It was a reflection of the emptiness he had carried inside him since the last cannons fell silent, and he came home to find nothing left but ghosts. Evelyn followed his gaze. The view through the frosted pane was terrifying in its immensity. There was nothing but snow and sky, a world without landmarks or mercy. It mirrored the hollow space inside her, the place where hope had once lived. She had run from a cage only to find herself in a different kind of prison, one made of ice and isolation. A shiver ran through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a tremor of profound, disorienting sensation. She was terrified, yet for the first time in years, no one was watching her, judging her, telling her who to be. She was simply alive. The feeling was so strange, so overwhelming, a cocktail of raw fear and a startling, unfamiliar relief. Unaware that he was still listening, that the room was small enough to carry any sound, she let out a breath she felt she had been holding for her entire married life. A single quiet whisper escaped her lips, spoken to the howling emptiness inside and out. "I've never felt anything like this." Cole heard it. The words were not meant for him, but they landed in the quiet of the cabin like a stone dropped into a deep well. He did not turn around. He just stared out at the snow, the woman's quiet confession of fear and wonder echoing in the silence of his own haunted heart. The days that followed were measured in the falling of snow. The world outside the cabin was a formless, shifting sea of white, the storm a living thing that breathed against the door and clawed at the window. Inside, a slow, tentative rhythm began to form, a fragile pattern of existence woven from the scent of brewing coffee, the crackle of burning pine, and the heavy weight of unspoken words. Evelyn's strength returned in small increments. First, it was the ability to sit up without the room spinning. Then, she was able to stand, her legs trembling but holding. She moved about the small cabin with a quiet determination, her pride a splint for her weakened body. She insisted on helping, her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of embroidery, now learning the rougher tasks of frontier life. She swept the hearth, her movements stiff and unfamiliar. She kneaded dough for biscuits, her knuckles aching with the effort. Each task was an assertion, a quiet declaration that she was a guest, not a dependent, and that her stay was temporary. "Once the snow stops, I will be on my way," she would say each morning, her voice gaining a little more strength each time. It became a kind of mantra, a shield against the unsettling comfort she was beginning to find in this small, warm space. Cole would simply nod, his gaze fixed on the task at hand, whether it was oiling a piece of leather or checking the action on his rifle. But he was not as indifferent as he seemed. He was a man who had cultivated silence, who had wrapped it around himself like a blanket against the cold memories of a loud and violent world. For years, the only sounds in his cabin were the wind, the fire, and his own breathing. Now, there were other sounds, the soft scuff of her stockinged feet on the wood floor, the low, unconscious hum that sometimes escaped her lips as she worked. Her voice, when she spoke, was a clear, low thing that cut through the quiet in a way that both soothed and disturbed him. He found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a tear in his shirt, her fingers moving with a forgotten grace. He watched the way the firelight caught the auburn strands in her hair. These small, domestic acts were like ghosts of a life he had buried long ago, a life with a mother's gentle hands and a sister's easy laughter. Her presence was a constant, aching reminder of a warmth he had taught himself to live without. It was a dangerous feeling, this stirring of old embers, and he fought against it with a stubborn, ingrained stoicism. The nights were the hardest. The storm would intensify after dusk, its voice rising to a mournful howl that seemed to creep through the very logs of the cabin. Trapped by the weather and the darkness, they would sit by the fire, the vast, empty plains of their pasts stretching between them. It was on the third night of her recovery that the silence finally broke, not with a crash, but with a quiet, hesitant question. "You have a limp," Evelyn observed, her gaze on the way he favored his right leg as he added a log to the fire. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. Cole settled back into his chair, the flames casting deep shadows across his weathered face. He stared into the fire for a long time before he spoke. "Gettysburg," he said, the word leaving his mouth like a piece of shrapnel he had carried for 25 years. "Took a piece of canister shot to the thigh." He did not elaborate, but Evelyn could see the battle in his eyes, a flicker of old fire and smoke. "You were in the war," she whispered, the history book she had secretly read coming to life in the form of this quiet, scarred man. "I was," he said, his voice flat. "Was a boy trying to be a man. Followed my brother, Thomas, into it. He was full of fire and belief, believed in the Union, in righteousness. I just believed in him." He paused, turning a small piece of wood over and over in his hands. "He didn't come back. They sent me home with this leg and his pocket watch. Seemed a poor trade." His words hung in the air, heavy with a grief so old it had become a part of him, like the limp in his leg. He spoke of losing their family's land afterward, of the lean years of reconstruction that had scattered what was left of his family to the winds. He had been drifting ever since, taking work where he could find it, a man without roots, a survivor haunted by the ghosts of better men who had not been so lucky. His guilt was a quiet, constant companion, a belief that he had lived when his brother, the better, braver one, had died. Evelyn listened, her own bitterness a cold stone in her chest. She saw his pain, recognized its shape, but her experience had taught her that all men, in the end, were takers. They took land, they took lives, they took women. When he fell silent, she found herself speaking, her voice thin but sharp with a long-suppressed anger. "My father had debts," she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "He was a good man, I think, but a weak one. He gambled on ventures that failed. When his creditors came to collect, he had nothing left to offer them, except me." She swallowed, the memory a bitter taste in her mouth. "Arthur Monroe was a wealthy man. He canceled my father's debts. The price was my hand in marriage. I was a piece of property in a transaction, passed from one man's ledger to another." She spoke of the coldness of her marriage, the suffocating expectations, the way her spirit had been slowly, methodically starved in a house full of fine things. Her bitterness was a shield against the pity she saw dawning in his eyes. She did not want his pity. Pity was a weakness, and she had sworn to never be weak again. Their confessions did not bring them closer, not at first. Instead, they drew a new, more complicated line between them. Her deep-seated mistrust of men, born of being used and discarded, clashed with his profound sense of failure, his guilt at having survived. They were two people who had been so deeply wounded by the world that they had forgotten how to accept kindness without searching for the price tag. Yet, the snow continued to fall, trapping them in their fragile truce. The shared space of the cabin forced an intimacy upon them. They learned the small rhythms of each other's existence. He learned that she drank her coffee with a little sugar, a small luxury he had on his shelf. She learned that he fell completely silent before dusk, his thoughts turning inward to places she could not follow. One afternoon, while telling a story about a clumsy calf from the cattle drive, he let out a short, rough bark of a laugh. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place on his grim face, that Evelyn found herself smiling in response. It was a brief, fragile moment, a single ray of sun in a winter sky, but it was enough to thaw a small piece of the ice between them. The storm reached its peak on the 7th night. It was no longer just a storm. It was a physical assault. The wind hit the cabin in great, shuddering gusts, and the entire structure groaned in protest. They were eating a simple meal of rabbit stew when a particularly violent blast of wind struck the cabin. It was followed by the sharp, explosive sound of shattering glass. Evelyn cried out, a raw, terrified sound, dropping her spoon with a clatter. Cold air and a flurry of snow burst into the room through the now empty window frame. The candles on the table flickered and died, plunging them into a world of firelight and roaring shadows. Before Cole could even move, she was on her feet, her fear a primal, unthinking thing. She did not run for the door or cower in a corner. She ran to him. She clung to him, her face buried in the rough wool of his shirt, her body trembling violently. Cole froze, his arms hovering uncertainly in the air. He was not used to being touched. He was not used to being a source of comfort, but the sheer force of her terror was undeniable. He slowly, hesitantly, wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She was so small in his arms, so fragile. He could feel the frantic, frightened beat of her heart against his chest. He held her, one hand resting on the small of her back, the other on her head, shielding her as if he could hold back the storm itself with his own body. The wind howled through the broken window, but inside his embrace, there was a small, defiant circle of warmth. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures clinging to each other as the world raged outside. When her trembling finally subsided, she did not pull away. The warmth between them, the simple, profound comfort of human contact, lingered. It was a heat that had nothing to do with the fire, a warmth that spread through Cole's chest, thawing places he had not known were frozen. He could feel her breath, warm and steady now, against his collarbone. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. "It is all right," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. "It was just the wind." She slowly lifted her head, her gray eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. She stepped back, a flush of embarrassment on her cheeks, wrapping her arms around herself as if to contain the feelings that had just spilled out of her. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for," Cole said gruffly, turning away to inspect the damage. "Storms do what they do." He found an old wooden shutter in the corner, a remnant from some previous repair, and began the work of fitting it into the broken frame. He worked with his back to her, needing the physical task to distract him from the feeling of her that still lingered on his skin. He could feel her watching him. Evelyn stood by the fire, her arms still wrapped tightly around her waist. She watched him work, his broad shoulders moving with a steady, capable strength as he hammered the shutter into place. He was blocking out the storm, making the world safe again. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. Safe. When had she ever felt safe? Not in her father's house, where she was a commodity to be sold. Certainly not in Arthur's house, where every creak of the floorboards at night could signal his unwanted approach. Tears began to well in her eyes, hot and silent. They were not tears of fear, but of a strange, heartbreaking relief. She watched the fine, powdery snow that still dusted the floor near the window, a reminder of the vast, cold wilderness that surrounded them. And yet, she was not afraid of it. Not anymore. Cole finished his work, driving the last nail home with a solid thud. The howling of the wind was muffled once more. The cabin returned to its state of beleaguered sanctuary. When he turned back to her, he saw the tears tracking silently down her cheeks. He took a hesitant step toward her, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was thick with an emotion he could not name. "It is just—" she began, then stopped, searching for the words. She looked from his face to the shuttered window, then back again. "I feel safer here, with you, in the middle of this storm, than I ever felt in my own home." Her confession was a quiet, devastating thing. It stripped away the last of her defenses, leaving her completely vulnerable. It was an admission of a life so devoid of comfort that a stranger's cabin in a blizzard felt like a haven. For Cole, her words were like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. They unlocked a fierce, protective instinct he thought the war had killed. They made him see not just a survivor, but a woman of incredible strength who had been forced to endure the absolute absence of kindness. He moved toward her, his intentions a mystery even to himself. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing away a tear from her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. He looked into her eyes and saw a reflection of his own loneliness, his own desperate need for a place to rest. The space between them crackled with a tension that was no longer about fear or suspicion. It was something new, something terrifying and beautiful. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. His mind screamed at him to stop, that he was no good, that he was a bringer of ruin. He saw a flash of another face, another woman from a time long past, her eyes wide with terror as he failed to save her from the chaos of a burning barn. The voice of that ghost whispered in his ear, a cold litany of his failures. He was a man who broke things. He could not, would not, break this woman too. He stopped, his lips just a breath from hers. He could see the confusion, the flicker of hope and fear in her eyes. With a strength that cost him more than he could ever explain, he pulled back, letting his hand drop to his side. A muscle in his jaw clenched. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice a low rasp. He turned away from her abruptly and walked to his cot in the far corner of the room, leaving her standing alone in the warm, flickering light of the fire. The physical storm outside had been shuttered, but a new one, more violent and unpredictable, had just been unleashed within the four walls of the cabin. It was a storm of unspoken desires, of haunting pasts, a maelstrom of two lonely souls who had briefly, impossibly, found a moment of shelter in each other, only to be torn apart again by the ghosts they carried inside. The morning the storm broke was unnervingly quiet. After more than a week of the wind's ceaseless howling, the silence that settled over the plains was as profound and heavy as a fresh layer of snow. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the cabin's window, illuminating a world transformed. Everything was buried, softened, and silenced beneath a thick blanket of white. The light cast long, blue shadows that stretched from the skeletal pines, making the landscape look both beautiful and desolate, a place of profound peace and profound loneliness. Inside the cabin, the quiet was of a different sort. It was a tense, brittle silence, thick with the unspoken things that had passed between them the night before. The almost kiss, the raw confession, his abrupt withdrawal, it all hung in the air, a palpable presence. Evelyn was already awake, dressed in her own clothes, which she had painstakingly dried by the fire. They were worn and travel-stained, but they were hers. She had folded Cole's wool shirt, the one that had been her sanctuary for days, and placed it neatly on the end of her makeshift bed. It was an act of finality, a drawing of a line. Cole was by the door, pulling on his heavy winter coat. He moved with a stiff, deliberate purpose, his face a mask of grim neutrality. He did not look at her, but he was aware of her every movement. "The storm's passed," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be dragged from somewhere deep inside him. "It will be a hard walk. The snow is deep." "I am aware," Evelyn replied, her own voice tight and formal. She was tying her cloak at her neck, her fingers fumbling slightly. "But I cannot stay. It would not be proper. I have taken enough of your charity." The word charity landed like a slap. "It was not charity," he said, his back still to her. "Whatever it was, it must end," she insisted, a note of desperation creeping into her tone. She was arguing as much with herself as with him. The thought of leaving the warmth and undeniable safety of this small cabin was terrifying. The world outside was vast and unknown, and her flight from Ash Hollow had already proven how ill-equipped she was to face it. But to stay would be to admit a reliance, a weakness, that her pride could not endure. Worse, it would be to acknowledge the strange, powerful current that flowed between them, a current that frightened her more than any blizzard. In her world, a woman who stayed with a man she was not married to was a ruined woman. She had fled one cage, she would not build another for herself, even if its walls felt like a safe embrace. "There is a town, Miller's Crossing, about 2 days' ride from here," Cole offered, finally turning to face her. "I can take you. My horse is strong enough for 2. If we go slow." The offer was a lifeline, and it was all she could do not to grasp it. But she saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Pity, perhaps, or a sense of duty, and her resolve hardened. She had to do this alone. She had to prove to herself, if to no one else, that she was not the helpless creature Arthur had tried to make her, that she could stand on her own 2 feet. "No," she said, her chin lifting. "Thank you, but no, I will walk." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. He saw the foolishness of her pride, the sheer danger of what she was attempting, but he also saw the fierce, defiant strength in her eyes, the same strength that had somehow kept her alive in the storm. To argue further would be to disrespect the very thing he was beginning to admire in her. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if accepting a defeat. He packed a small bundle for her without asking, a strip of dried beef, a small pouch of nuts, and a canteen of water. He pressed it into her hands, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was like a spark of electricity, and they both pulled back as if burned. "Keep to the high ground where the wind has scoured the snow," he instructed, his voice all business. "Follow the line of the creek. It will eventually lead you toward the valley where the town is." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Carson." "My name is Cole," he said quietly. She looked up then, and for a moment, the fragile connection between them was visible again. "Evelyn," she whispered. "My name is Evelyn." He opened the door, and the cold, clean air flooded the cabin. The sunlight on the snow was dazzlingly bright. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped out of the warmth and into the cold. Silent world. Cole watched her go, a small, solitary figure moving slowly through the vast whiteness. He watched until she was just a dark speck against the horizon, and then he closed the door, the cabin suddenly feeling emptier and colder than it had in all the years he had lived there alone. The walking was brutal, the sun on the snow was blinding, and the cold was a sharp, biting thing that seeped through the layers of her clothing. Cole had been right. The snow was deep, in some places drifting up to her waist. She fought for every step, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. The world was a vast, silent cathedral of white and blue, beautiful but utterly indifferent to her struggle. There were no landmarks, no signs of life, save for the occasional track of a rabbit or a fox. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. As the day wore on, the initial fire of her determination began to fade, replaced by a gnawing fear. The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of pale pink and orange. The blue shadows of the afternoon lengthened, turning the pristine snow into a landscape of dark, menacing shapes. With the fading light came a new and ancient sound, the howl of a wolf. It started as a single, mournful cry that echoed across the frozen valley. Evelyn froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Then another voice answered, closer this time, and then another. A pack. They had her scent. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She began to run, stumbling through the deep drifts, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She could hear them now, the soft padding of their paws on the snow, a sound that was somehow more terrifying than their howls. She scrambled up the side of a small ridge, her hands raw from the icy crust of the snow. She found herself on the bank of a frozen creek, the ice a sheet of black glass under the rising moon. A line of sparse, skeletal trees offered the only semblance of cover. She backed up against the trunk of the largest one, her eyes darting wildly into the gathering gloom. They emerged from the shadows, their forms gray and spectral against the snow. There were 4 of them. They did not rush her. They circled, their movements fluid and confident, their yellow eyes glowing with a cold, predatory intelligence. They were testing her, watching her. Their low growls, a vibration she could feel in the pit of her stomach. She was trapped. Her flight for freedom had led her here, to this frozen creek bank, to be torn apart by wild animals. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. Perhaps this was a more fitting end than freezing to death. It was certainly quicker. Just as the largest wolf gathered itself to spring, a sound cracked through the twilight stillness, sharp and deafening. The report of a rifle. The bullet whined past her head and slammed into the ice of the creek, sending a spiderweb of cracks across the surface. The wolves scattered, melting back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared, their hunt spoiled by this sudden, violent intrusion. Evelyn slid down the tree trunk, her legs giving out from under her. She was trembling so violently she could not control it. A figure emerged from the trees on horseback, a dark silhouette against the snow. It was Cole. He dismounted, his rifle still in his hand, and strode toward her. "I told you it was a hard walk," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not decipher. Anger, relief. She could not answer. Her throat was tight with unshed tears, her body racked with the aftermath of pure terror. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. The moment she was upright, all the pride, all the fierce independence that had driven her out into the wilderness, crumbled into dust. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest, and finally, let herself break. Sobs tore through her. Raw, ugly sounds of fear and exhaustion and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound. She clung to him as she had during the storm. But this was different. This was not an involuntary reaction to a sudden noise. This was a conscious surrender. She was giving him all her broken pieces, all her fear, all her despair. Cole held her, his arms a solid, unshakable circle around her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply held her, absorbing the force of her grief, his hand stroking her hair in a slow, steady rhythm. He led her to his horse, lifted her into the saddle, and then mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, enclosing her in his warmth, and urged the horse forward, back toward the cabin. That night, the tension between them did not just break, it shattered. He sat her down by the fire, wrapping her in a thick blanket, and handed her a cup of hot, sweet coffee. She drank it, her hands still shaking. Neither of them spoke of what had happened. There were no words for it. They simply sat in the flickering firelight, the silence between them no longer brittle, but charged with a new, dangerous energy. He had followed her. He had not trusted her to make it on her own. He had watched over her. The knowledge settled deep inside her, a warm, heavy thing. He had saved her. Again. She looked up at him, her eyes still shimmering with tears. He was watching her, his face stripped of its usual stoicism. In the warm, dancing light of the fire, she could see the deep lines of weariness around his eyes, the ghost of old pains, and something else, a raw, unguarded tenderness that stole her breath. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. It was the same gesture he had made before, but this time, there were no ghosts to stop him. This time, there was only the cold, hard reality of the present moment. Two lonely, wounded people who had been pushed to the absolute limit. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, born of the stark, terrifying knowledge of how close she had come to death. It was a kiss of fear and gratitude, of relief and a deep, aching need that had been simmering between them for days. She responded with equal fervor, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. It was an affirmation of life, a desperate, defiant act against the cold, cruel world that waited just outside the door. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his cot. Their clothes seemed to melt away in the heat of the fire, in the heat of their need. They made love with a raw, silent urgency, a language of touch that spoke more than words ever could. It was tender, yet desperate, a frantic exploration of skin and warmth and the simple, staggering miracle of being alive and together in the vast, empty wilderness. Every touch was a question, every caress an answer. In the silence of the cabin, with the moon shining on the endless snow outside, they found a brief, fragile sanctuary in each other's arms, a place where the ghosts of the past and the fears of the future were, for a few precious hours, held at bay. Morning came too soon, the pale gray light of dawn creeping into the cabin like an unwelcome intruder. With the light came clarity, and with clarity came guilt. Evelyn woke first, entangled in the warmth of Cole's arms, his steady breathing a comforting presence beside her. For a fleeting moment, she felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. Then the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She was in the bed of a man who was not her husband, in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of the God she had been taught to fear. She was a fallen woman, an adulteress. She had fled her marriage to be free, only to trade one form of ruin for another. A cold shame washed over her, chilling her more than the morning air. Cole stirred, his eyes opening. He looked at her, and for a moment, the tenderness of the night before was still there. Then he seemed to remember, and a shuttered, guarded look came over his face. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. He felt a sharp, bitter pang of self-loathing. He had taken advantage of her. She had been terrified, vulnerable, and he had used her moment of weakness to satisfy his own lonely desires. He was no better than the men who had hurt her, the men who saw women as things to be taken. He rose from the bed without a word, dressed quickly, and grabbed his axe from beside the door. "Need to gather wood," he mumbled, not looking at her. And then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click behind him. Evelyn watched him go, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. He regretted it. Of course he did. She was a complication, a burden he had rescued from the snow and was now saddled with. She lay back on the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. The scent of him, of wood smoke and leather and man, clinging to the fabric. She closed her eyes, and to her surprise, it was not shame or regret that filled her, but a strange, fierce sense of life. Last night, in his arms, she had felt not ruined, but awakened. For the first time since she was a girl, she had felt like a person, not property. A slow, sad smile touched her lips. She felt more alive at this moment, in all her supposed ruin, than she had in all her years of respectable misery. She watched him through the frosted window as he split logs with a powerful, rhythmic grace. Each swing of the axe was clean, efficient, final. He was a man of action, not words. A man who faced the harshness of the world head-on. And he had saved her. Not just from the storm, not just from the wolves, but from the creeping numbness that had been slowly killing her soul. Her past found her just as the sun cleared the tops of the distant mountains. The sound of approaching horses made her heart freeze. She looked out the window and saw two men riding toward the cabin. They were rough-looking men, with hard faces and guns strapped to their hips. She recognized one of them instantly. A man named Jed, one of her husband's hired hands. A man whose leering gaze had always made her skin crawl. Panic seized her. She looked wildly around the cabin. A cornered animal seeking an escape that did not exist. The men dismounted, their spurs jingling in the cold air. The cabin door burst open without a knock. Jed's eyes, small and cruel, swept the room and landed on her. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here, the runaway wife, playing house with a drifter, are we?" "What do you want?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling but defiant. "What do we want?" Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Mister, Monroe wants his property back. His horse, the money you stole, and you—" "I stole nothing," she shot back. "The horse is dead, and the money was mine." "That is not how he tells it," the other man grunted, stepping forward. "He says you are a thief and a harlot, and he is offering a handsome reward for your return." They lunged for her. She fought back, kicking and scratching, but they were too strong. They dragged her from the cabin, her cries lost in the vast, empty landscape. Jed threw her toward his horse, his grip bruising her arm. It was then that Cole returned. He came around the side of the cabin, the axe still in his hand, and stopped dead. His eyes took in the scene. Evelyn struggling. The two men, their horses, his face, which had been a mask of conflicted guilt moments before, hardened into something cold and lethal. He dropped the axe. "Let her go," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable threat that cut through the cold morning air. Jed turned, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "This ain't your concern, friend. Just a private matter between a man and his wife." "I said," Cole repeated, taking a slow step forward, his hands empty and held slightly away from his sides. "Let her go." The world seemed to hold its breath. The valley was silent, save for the nervous stamping of the horses. Jed's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. He drew his gun. "You want to die for her?" he snarled. The explosion of gunfire was deafening. It echoed off the frozen hills, a sharp, violent sound that shattered the morning peace. The world erupted in a chaos of noise and motion. Cole moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, a fluid and deadly grace born of old, violent muscle memory. He was not the quiet, brooding man who chopped wood and stared into the fire. He was a soldier again. As Jed's gun came up, Cole was already drawing the Colt peacemaker that had been tucked, unseen, into the back of his waistband. His shot was a fraction of a second faster. Jed grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face. As a dark red stain blossomed on his chest, he staggered backward, his own shot going wild. Kicking up a spray of snow and dirt a yard to Cole's left, he fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the snow, his gun dropping from his lifeless hand. The second man, who had been holding Evelyn, shoved her to the ground and scrambled for his own weapon. But the sight of his dead companion and the cold, unblinking finality in Cole's eyes was enough. His nerve broke. With a panicked curse, he abandoned his drawn pistol, lunged for the reins of his horse, and hauled himself into the saddle. He spared one last, terrified look at Cole, his face a mask of hate and fear. "This is not over!" he screamed, his voice thin and reedy in the cold air. "Monroe will pay a bounty for you both. You are dead men walking." He dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and the animal bolted, galloping wildly back the way they had come, leaving a trail of churned-up snow in its wake. The silence that descended was more profound than the one that had followed the blizzard. It was a dead, ringing silence, punctuated only by the heavy panting of Cole's breath and the soft, whimpering sound Evelyn realized was coming from her own throat. The smell of gunpowder, sharp and acrid, hung in the air. Cole stood for a long moment, the gun still steady in his hand, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the second man. Then, a shudder went through him. He looked down at the gun in his hand as if seeing it for the first time, a look of profound self-disgust on his face. He lowered it slowly, and only then did Evelyn see the dark patch of red spreading across his left side, just above his hip. "Cole," she breathed, scrambling to her feet. "You are hurt." He looked down, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, as if he had not even registered the wound. "It is just a graze," he said, his voice strained. But as he spoke, his face went pale, and he swayed on his feet, his left hand coming up to press against the wound. He had not been hit by Jed's wild shot. The second man, in his initial panic, must have fired. In the chaos, she had not even heard it. "Help me get him inside," Evelyn said, her voice taking on a new, sharp authority that surprised even her. She grabbed Cole's arm, draping it over her shoulders, and took his weight. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and she staggered under the load. The man on the ground was a stark, bloody punctuation mark in the pristine snow, but she did not look at him. She could not. All that mattered was the warm, living weight of the man beside her. Getting him into the cabin and onto the cot was a monumental struggle. He collapsed onto the rough blankets with a low groan, his face beaded with sweat. The guilt that had been a vague, formless thing in the early morning now crystallized into a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest. This was her fault, her past, her flight. Her very existence had brought this violence to his doorstep, had spilled blood in this quiet, solitary place. She had brought the ugliness of her world into his. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, pushing down the rising tide of panic. She tore strips from one of her petticoats, her hands shaking. She peeled back his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was ugly, a deep furrow in the flesh along his side where the bullet had torn through. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was not as bad as she had feared. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh, missing bone and, she prayed, anything vital. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from a bottle on his shelf, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He hissed in pain, his body going rigid, but he did not cry out. She packed the wound as best she could and bound it tightly with the clean strips of cloth. For the rest of the day, he drifted in and out of a feverish, restless sleep, muttering names she did not know. Thomas, Shiloh, Antietam, fragments of a past more violent than she could imagine. She tended to him, her guilt a constant, aching presence. She fetched water, kept the fire going, and sat by his side, bathing his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. In the late afternoon, summoning a strength she did not know she possessed, she dragged the body of the man named Jed away from the cabin, covering it with a mound of snow and rocks behind the lean-to. It was a crude, shallow grave, but it was the best she could do. She did not want Cole to see him when he woke. When Cole's fever finally broke 2 days later, he was weak but lucid. He opened his eyes and saw her sitting in the chair by the fire, her head slumped forward in exhausted sleep. He watched her for a long time, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the weary set of her jaw. She had stayed. She had not run. She had saved him. That evening, as she was changing his dressing, the silence between them stretched, taut and heavy. "You should have left," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You should have been long gone from here." Evelyn finished tying the bandage, her movements precise. She did not look at him. "I could not leave you," she said simply. "And besides, where would I go? Your friend promised a bounty. I imagine my husband is a man who keeps his promises in his own way." "He is not your friend," Cole said, his voice hard. "And this is my fight now." "No," she said, finally meeting his gaze, her own eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "This is my fight. You were just standing in the way. This violence, that man outside, it followed me here. I brought this to you. Cole, I am so sorry." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of guilt and shame. She turned away, but he reached out, his hand surprisingly strong, and caught her wrist. "Evelyn," he said, his voice softer now. "Look at me." She turned back, and he held her gaze. "I made my choice. No one forced my hand." His words did not absolve her of her guilt, but they offered a small measure of comfort. She knew then that she had to try to leave again. She could not be the cause of any more pain for him. "When you are stronger," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I must go. It is the only way to keep you safe." "No," he said, his grip on her wrist tightening slightly. It was not a command, but a plea. "Do not, just stay, at least until I am on my feet. Please." She looked at his face, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and she knew she could not refuse him. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and so she stayed. The days that followed were quiet, cocooned in the aftermath of violence. They were suspended in a strange, intimate limbo, two people healing from different kinds of wounds. As Cole's body slowly mended, something else began to knit together between them, something fragile and tentative. They talked, not with the guarded, painful confessions of before, but with a new, quiet ease. They learned the topography of each other's scars. One afternoon, as she sat by his cot, mending his torn shirt, he asked her about her husband, about the life she had fled. And this time, she told him everything. She spoke not just of the cold transactions and the public humiliations, but of the private cruelties. She told him of the nights he would come to her bed, smelling of whiskey and anger, using her body as a vessel for his frustrations, his touch leaving her feeling soiled and empty. She spoke of the suffocating silence of her life, the way he had tried to systematically erase any part of her that was her own, her books, her drawings, her thoughts. "He never hit me where it would show," she said, her voice a low, emotionless monotone as she stared at the needle moving in and out of the fabric. "He was too clever for that. He wanted the world to see a perfect wife. The bruises were all on the inside. I used to lie awake at night and dream of running, not to anywhere in particular, just running until the cold or the hunger took me. It seemed a sweeter end than the one he had planned for me." Cole listened without interruption, his face a hard mask of controlled fury. When she finished, he did not offer pity or platitudes. He simply reached out and took her hand, the one that was not holding the needle, and held it. His touch was firm, steady, a silent acknowledgement of her pain, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive. Later, she asked him about the names he had spoken in his fever, and he, in turn, began to speak of the war. He told her about his brother, Thomas, about his easy laugh and his unwavering belief in the cause. He described the horror of the battlefield, the noise, the smoke, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the killing. He spoke of the promises he had made to their mother, that he would look after Thomas, that he would bring him home. "I was with him when he fell," Cole said, his eyes looking past her, into a memory a quarter of a century old. "It was so loud, you could not hear yourself think, but I heard him call my name. I found him in the mud, and he just looked at me. He tried to speak, but there was only blood. I held him until he was gone. I buried my own brother in a field in Pennsylvania, 1,000 miles from home." He fell silent, his throat working. "I survived, and for the life of me, I have never understood why." Their confessions were not a competition of sorrows. They were a quiet recognition. They saw in each other a fellow survivor, a soul who understood that the world was a hard, unforgiving place, and that happy endings were the stuff of fairy tales. They were not drawn together by pity, but by a profound, unspoken empathy. They were two sides of the same battered coin. One evening, after she had helped him to the chair by the fire, he looked at her, his expression serious. "Evelyn," he asked quietly, "do you regret it? The other night?" She knew he was not talking about the gunfight. She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I do not regret it." She paused, a sad smile touching her lips. "But I am afraid of it. The world will not let a man like you and a woman like me be together. They will call you a protector of a harlot, and me, well, they are already calling me far worse." "I do not give a damn what the world calls us," he said, his voice a low growl. Outside, the world was changing. The great melt had begun. During the day, the sun was warm enough to turn the surface of the snow to slush. The plains began to weep, water trickling and then running in small rivers down every slope. The land, which had been a pristine, uniform white, was now a mottled canvas of brown and white. The mud was thick and clinging, a treacherous mire that sucked at the boots. The melting snow revealed the bones of the land, and the bones of those who had tried to tame it. Near the creek, the thaw uncovered the skeletal remains of a long-dead steer, and further on, the splintered wood of an old wagon wheel, a relic of some other forgotten tragedy. Spring was trying to arrive, a slow, painful birth, but the land was still half frozen, caught between the death of winter and the promise of life. Their hearts, too, felt trapped in that same muddy, uncertain season. One evening, a week after the shooting, Cole was sitting by the fire, slowly and methodically sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was the only sound in the cabin. He was stronger now, able to move about on his own, though his side was still stiff and sore. Evelyn sat on the bearskin rug, watching the flames. A profound melancholy had settled over her, a sorrow for all that had been lost, and a fear for what was to come. Without thinking, she began to hum a tune, a soft, sad lullaby her mother used to sing to her. Then, words came, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper in the quiet room. It was a song of lost love and lonely roads, of sorrow and a faint, resilient flicker of hope. She sang for herself, for him, for the ghosts that haunted them both. The sound of the knife on the stone stopped. Cole had lowered his hands and was watching her, his expression one of rapt attention. When she finished, the last note hanging in the air like a prayer, he did not move for a long time. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He looked at her then, his eyes clear and full of a deep, weary understanding. "Maybe we both needed saving," he said, his voice quiet. His words were not a declaration of love, not a promise of a future. They were something simpler, and perhaps more profound. They were an admission of shared brokenness, a recognition that they had, in saving each other, perhaps found a way to save themselves. And for the first time since she had fled the cold, empty house in Ash Hollow, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn smiled. It was not a sad, tired smile, nor a polite, forced one. It was a real smile, one that started deep inside her and reached her eyes, lighting them from within with a small, hesitant warmth. It was a smile without fear. The news arrived on the back of a horse, carried by a grizzled old prospector named Silas, who was passing through the valley on his way to somewhere better. He was a man whose face was a roadmap of hard luck and bad weather, and he was grateful for the offer of a hot meal and a cup of coffee. He shared it with Cole and Evelyn at their small, rough-hewn table, his presence an intrusion on the quiet world they had built, but a welcome one for the news he brought of the outside world. It was in the idle chatter, between a complaint about the price of beans and a story about a promising vein of silver, that he dropped the stone that shattered the fragile piece of their existence. "Heard some strange news from down Ash Hollow way," Silas said, slurping his coffee. "Big man in town, a merchant by the name of Monroe, burned up in a saloon fire a couple of weeks back. The whole place went up like a tinderbox." Evelyn's hand, which had been lifting her own cup, froze halfway to her lips. A profound, deathly stillness came over her. Cole saw the blood drain from her face, her eyes going wide and dark. He reached out under the table and placed his hand on her knee, a silent, steadying pressure. Silas, oblivious, continued his story. "Strangest part is the talk. They say his wife ran off just before it happened. Some folks are saying she had a hand in it, that she set the fire to cover her tracks after running off with another man and a fat sack of her husband's gold. The law's been looking for her, put a price on her head and everything. $500 for the capture of a murdering, runaway wife. He shook his head, a grim amusement in his eyes. Woman must have had ice water in her veins to do something like that. He finally seemed to notice the charged silence in the cabin. He looked from Evelyn's pale, stricken face to Cole's hard, unreadable expression. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Well now," he said slowly, putting his cup down. "Seems I have said something I ought not to have," after the prospector had made a hasty and awkward departure. Evelyn stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring out at the muddy, half-frozen landscape. The world outside looked just as bleak and torn as she felt inside. Her husband was dead. She should have felt relief, a sense of liberation. Instead, all she felt was a cold, creeping dread. She was no longer just a runaway. She was a wanted murderer. Arthur, it seemed, had managed to cage her even from beyond the grave, his reputation and his lies reaching out to brand her, to hunt her down. "They will never stop looking for me now," she whispered, her voice hollow. $500 is a fortune. Every bounty hunter, every desperate man from here to the territories will be on the lookout. Cole came to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the solid, reassuring warmth of his presence. "Then we run," he said, his voice a low, determined rumble. "We ride west, far west. We can make it to Montana, maybe even over the mountains into Oregon country. Find a place so remote they will never think to look for us. We can start over, be new people." His offer was a vision of a future she had not dared to dream of. A life with him, away from the whispers and the judgments. A clean slate on which they could write their own story. It was everything she had ever wanted, and yet she knew she could not take it. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a sad, weary resolve. "No," she said softly. "I have been running my whole life. Cole, I ran from my father's house into a marriage that was a prison. I ran from that prison into a blizzard that nearly killed me. I am tired of running from the world's judgment. If I run now, I will be running forever. That brand, murderer, it will follow me. It will follow us. It will poison whatever life we try to build." "What other choice do we have?" he demanded, a note of desperation in his voice. "You heard the man. They want you caught. They do not care about the truth." "Then I will give them the truth," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will ride into Miller's Crossing. I will go to the sheriff. I will tell him my story. I will not live the rest of my life as a ghost, looking over my shoulder. I would rather face a hangman's noose as an honest woman than live a long life as a coward." He stared at her, his expression a mixture of fear and a profound, reluctant admiration. He saw the foolishness, the sheer, breathtaking risk of her plan, but he also saw that her spirit, the one he had seen flicker to life in this very cabin, would be extinguished by a life on the run. To flee would be to let Arthur win, to let the world's lies define her, to stand and fight, even if she lost, was the only way for her to truly be free. "You will not go alone," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "If you are facing them, you are facing them with me." The ride to Miller's Crossing took 2 days. They rode side by side, two solitary figures moving through a landscape that was slowly, painfully coming back to life. The air was warmer, carrying the scent of damp earth and melting snow. Small, determined green shoots were pushing their way up through the mud. It was a world of messy, uncertain rebirth, a reflection of their own journey. They spoke little, but a deep, unspoken understanding flowed between them. They were a united front, two against the world. For Evelyn, the feeling was entirely new. She had never had anyone stand with her before. The fear of what lay ahead was a cold knot in her stomach, but beside it, a small, warm flame of courage had been kindled. Miller's Crossing was not much of a town. It was a handful of rough, unpainted buildings huddled along a muddy main street, a temporary outpost of civilization in a vast and untamed wilderness. As they rode in, a hush fell over the street. Doors opened, and faces appeared in windows. People stopped what they were doing to stare. News, carried by men like Silas, traveled fast in the back country. They saw a hard-faced man with a gun on his hip and a pale, determined woman with a fugitive's shadow in her eyes. They saw the story the bounty posters had told them. The glares were like physical blows. Women pulled their children closer, their faces tight with righteous condemnation. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass, their expressions ranging from cold curiosity to open hostility. One man, lounging on the porch of the general store, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud near Evelyn's horse, a gesture of profound, casual contempt. She felt her courage waver, the old shame rising in her throat. She wanted to turn the horse, to flee back to the safety of the wilderness. Then she felt Cole's presence beside her, solid and unmoving. He did not react to the stares or the whispers. His gaze was fixed on the sheriff's office at the end of the street, his face a granite mask. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, meeting the hostile gazes with a cool dignity she did not know she possessed. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. The man behind the desk was older than Cole, with a kind, weary face and a thick, graying mustache. He looked up as they entered, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face as he saw Cole. "Cole Carson," he said, his voice a slow, western drawl. "I will be damned. I have not seen you since you helped me track those rustlers up on the Powder River. What brings you down to this end of the world?" "Business. Sheriff Davis," Cole said, his voice calm and even. He gestured toward Evelyn. "This is Evelyn. She has come to turn herself in." Sheriff Davis's friendly expression evaporated. He looked from Cole to Evelyn, his eyes taking in her worn dress, her proud but tired bearing. His gaze was professional, but not unkind. "I see," he said slowly. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. It was a wanted poster, with a crude drawing that looked nothing like her, but the name was there. Evelyn Monroe. "Says here you are wanted for theft and murder. Says you burned down a saloon to kill your husband." "What it says," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady, "is a lie." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, stroking his mustache. He looked at Cole. "You vouch for this woman. Cole? You know what they are saying about her." "I know what I know," Cole replied. "And I know she deserves to tell her side of the story." Sheriff Davis sighed, a long, weary sound. "All right, Mrs. Monroe," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Let us hear it." Evelyn sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Cole stood behind her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him everything, starting with her father's debts and her forced marriage. She spoke of Arthur's coldness, his quiet cruelties, the suffocating life she had led. She told him of her flight, of the storm, of how Cole had saved her. She told him of the men who had come to the cabin, of the gunfight, of the man who had escaped vowing revenge. When she got to the night of the fire, her voice faltered. The memory, which she had pushed down into the deepest, darkest corner of her mind, rose up, sharp and vivid. She was not in the dusty sheriff's office anymore. She was back in the parlor of her house in Ash Hollow, the night she had decided to run. She had been gathering her things, her small bundle of money and a few personal keepsakes. When Arthur had come home, he was drunk, his eyes red-rimmed and furious. He had heard the stable boy talking, heard the whispers that his horse was being readied for a journey. "Where do you think you are going?" he had snarled, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh-like claws. "Let go of me, Arthur," she had said, trying to pull away. His rage, usually a cold, controlled thing, had finally boiled over. He had backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling backward into a small table. A lit candle, one of the few lights in the room, teetered on the edge. "You are mine," he had shouted, his face contorted. You will not leave me. You will not shame me. He had lunged for her, and in the ensuing struggle, the table was overturned. The candle fell, rolling across the floor and coming to rest against the heavy velvet curtains. Neither of them noticed at first. They were locked in a desperate, ugly battle. Her fear and his rage a whirlwind in the center of the room. He was trying to drag her toward the stairs, toward their bedroom, and she was fighting with a strength she did not know she had. She had finally managed to break free. Shoving him with all her might, he had stumbled backward, his drunken momentum carrying him into a heavy wooden bookshelf. He hit his head with a sickening crack and slumped to the floor, stunned but not unconscious. It was then that she saw the flames. The curtains were ablaze, the fire climbing the walls with a terrifying speed. For a moment, she had frozen. She looked at the fire, and then at the man groaning on the floor. A part of her, a cold, dark part, wanted to just walk out the door and let him burn. It would be justice. But she could not. She ran to him, trying to pull him toward the door. "Arthur, get up! The house is on fire!" He was a dead weight, his eyes glazed over. He swatted at her weakly. "Leave me be, woman," he mumbled. The smoke was getting thick, choking her. The roar of the fire was deafening. She knew she had only seconds. She made one last, desperate attempt to move him, but he was too heavy. She had to choose, stay and die with him, or run and live. She ran. She did not know he had left the house earlier that evening and gone to the saloon. She did not know he would stumble out of the burning house and die of his injuries on the street. All she knew was the fire and the running. When her story was finished, she was trembling, tears streaming down her face. The sheriff's office was silent. Sheriff Davis sat behind his desk, his face grim, his eyes thoughtful. He looked at Cole, who had not moved, his hand still a firm, steady presence on her chair. He looked at Evelyn, at the raw, honest pain on her face. Finally, he spoke. "I believe you, Mrs. Monroe," he said quietly. "Your story has the ring of truth to it, and Cole Carson is not a man who stands by liars or killers." A wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over Evelyn. "So, I am free to go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The sheriff's expression turned sad. "It is not that simple," he said, shaking his head. "I believe you, but I am just one man. The law is a clumsy thing. The official story is that you are a thief and a murderer. Your husband was a respected man, the man who escaped that gunfight at the cabin. His name is Ben Carter. He has been telling anyone who will listen that Cole here is your partner, that you are a pair of cold-blooded killers. There is a bounty on both your heads now. I cannot just tear up the posters and tell everyone to go home. The town, the world, they have their story, and they will not give it up easily." He leaned forward, his voice low. "My advice to you is the same advice Cole probably gave you. Ride hard and fast, and do not look back. Find a new place, a new name, because this town, this part of the country, it will never forget. You will always be the runaway wife, and he will always be the gunslinger who protects her. You will never find peace here." They left town that night, under a bruised purple sky that promised more bad weather to come. They were not fugitives running from justice, but exiles, cast out by a world that had already judged them. The sheriff had given them what supplies he could spare, a silent gesture of support, but they both knew they were on their own. They made camp a few miles out of town, in a small clearing sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. The fire crackled, a small, bright point of warmth in the vast, gathering dark. They sat side by side on a fallen log, staring into the flames, the weight of their new reality settling over them. They had no home, no names they could safely use, no future they could plan for. They had nothing but the horses they rode, the clothes on their backs, and each other. Evelyn reached out and touched his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they wrapped around hers, a firm, comforting anchor in a sea of uncertainty. "I have never felt anything like this," she said softly, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Not even when I was a girl and thought I was in love. Not ever." She was not talking about the fear or the exile. She was talking about the feeling of his hand in hers, the quiet strength of having someone sit beside her in the dark, sharing her burden without question. It was a feeling of profound, terrifying, and beautiful connection. Cole did not answer for a long time. He just squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady rumble, a promise in the darkness. "Then hold on to it," he said. "Hold on to it, no matter how cold it gets." They rode west. The word became their compass, their prayer, their entire world. West, away from the judgmental eyes of Miller's Crossing, away from the long, grasping shadow of Ash Hollow. West, toward the hazy promise of the horizon, a place where their pasts might finally be too tired to follow. They rode through the last of the mud season, the land slowly firming up beneath their horses' hooves. They crossed rolling plains that gave way to jagged badlands, a country carved by wind and water into shapes of stark, brutal beauty. They were two small, insignificant figures in a landscape of terrifying scale. Yet, for the first time, Evelyn did not feel small. Beside Cole, she felt as if she were a part of it, as vast and resilient as the sky above them. For weeks, they lived a life of constant motion. They hunted for their food, slept under a blanket of stars so thick and bright it felt close enough to touch, and spoke of a future that was a vague, unformed dream. They were no longer running from something. They were moving toward it. The bounty on their heads was a constant, unspoken threat, a spur that kept them pushing onward. But the fear was a dull ache now, not the sharp, stabbing pain it had once been. They found the ranch by chance, tucked away in a shallow valley where a small, clear creek cut through a grove of cottonwood trees. It was a place that had been started with hope and abandoned in despair. The cabin was little more than a ruin, its roof caved in on one side, its door hanging from a single leather hinge. The barn beside it was a skeleton of weathered gray wood, and the corral fence had long since collapsed. Weeds and wildflowers grew in a tangled riot where a garden had once been. It was a place of ghosts, a monument to a failed dream. To anyone else, it would have been a heartbreaking sight. To Cole and Evelyn, it was a promise. "It is sheltered here," Cole said, his voice quiet as he surveyed the valley from the back of his horse. "Good water. The land looks like it has some life in it." Evelyn looked at the broken-down cabin, at the wild, untamed beauty of the small valley, and she saw not a ruin, but a canvas. "It is a start," she whispered, a feeling of fierce, proprietary hope blooming in her chest. "It is a place to be." They slid from their horses, the long journey finally at an end. They had found their sanctuary. The work that followed was the hardest either of them had ever known. But it was a good, clean hardship. It was the work of building, not running. They attacked the task with a shared, silent determination, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, as if they had been working side by side their entire lives. With his axe and her unwavering resolve, they became architects of a new life. They started with the cabin. Cole, with his quiet, practical strength, cleared the fallen timbers and began the painstaking process of rebuilding the roof, using sod cut from the prairie to seal it against the wind and rain. Evelyn worked alongside him, her hands, once soft and pale, becoming chapped, calloused, and strong. She chinked the logs with a mixture of mud and grass, her fingers pushing the thick plaster into every crack, sealing their small home against the vast wilderness outside. She cleared the inside of the cabin, sweeping away the nests of mice and the dust of years, scrubbing the floorboards until the clean scent of pine filled the small space. For a time, peace seemed not only possible, but real. The world shrank to the boundaries of their valley. Their days were filled with the simple, satisfying rhythms of survival and creation. They rebuilt the corral, planted a small garden with seeds Cole had traded for in a town 2 weeks back, and dug out the spring-fed well until the water ran clear and cold. Evelyn found she had a talent for making things grow, and soon tender green shoots of beans and corn pushed their way through the dark, rich earth. In the evenings, they would sit on the newly built porch of their cabin, watching the sun set, painting the endless sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep, bruised purple. They would talk, sharing stories of their childhoods, small, simple memories that had been buried under years of pain. He told her about fishing for trout with his brother, Thomas, and she told him about a secret hiding place she had in an old oak tree where she would read the books her father forbade. They were reclaiming their pasts, not as sources of trauma, but as the simple stories of the people they had once been. One night, as they sat watching the stars emerge, she rested her head on his shoulder. "I think I am happy, Cole," she said, the admission a quiet surprise even to herself. "I do not think I have ever known what that word truly meant until now." He put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Me neither," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, and in the quiet of the valley, under the vast, open sky, it felt true. The ghosts of their pasts seemed to have finally grown tired, the noise of the world a distant, faded memory. But the past does not rest. It is patient. It waits. The first sign was a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, a prickling on the back of the neck that said they were no longer alone. Their horses grew skittish, their ears twitching at sounds only they could hear. Cole became quieter, his eyes constantly scanning the ridge that overlooked their valley, his hand never straying far from the colt at his hip. He found a single, discarded cigar butt near the creek, far from any established trail. It was still fresh. Someone was watching them. The dread returned, a cold, familiar serpent coiling in Evelyn's stomach. Their peace had been an illusion, a brief, beautiful interlude before the final act of a tragedy she had written with her own flight. They came in the dead of night, under the sliver of a new moon. There were 5 of them, dark shapes on horseback, moving with a quiet, predatory confidence. At their head was Ben Carter, the man who had escaped the gunfight at Cole's cabin, his face a mask of bitter, vengeful satisfaction in the faint starlight. Evelyn was woken not by a sound, but by a sudden, unnatural light. A flickering orange glow was dancing on the walls of the cabin. She looked out the window, and a cry of pure terror escaped her lips. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry, weathered wood, a roaring, hungry beast consuming their hard work, consuming their fragile peace. Cole was already out of the cot, pulling on his boots, his face grim and set. "Stay inside," he commanded, grabbing his rifle from its pegs on the wall. "Bar the door and stay away from the window." But she would not. She would not hide and cower while he fought her battle. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She grabbed the box of cartridges from the shelf. "I can load. I can help." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not anger, but a deep, fierce pride. He gave her a short, sharp nod, and then he was out the door, melting into the shadows. The night exploded into a nightmare of sound and light. The roar of the fire was punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire, the angry whine of bullets cutting through the dark. Muzzle flashes lit up the yard in brief. Terrifying tableaus, a man falling from his horse, the twisted, hateful face of Ben Carter, the calm, focused intensity of Cole as he fired from behind the cover of the well. Evelyn knelt on the floor of the cabin, her back against the wall, her hands working with a speed and precision that felt alien. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but her hands were steady. She filled the empty chambers of a second rifle, the one Cole kept as a spare, her movements sure and purposeful. The woman who had been terrified of a broken window was gone. The woman who had fainted at the sight of her own blood was a distant memory. In their place was a woman who was fighting for her home, for her life, for the only man who had ever seen her as more than property. She saw a shadow move near the side of the cabin, trying to get a clear shot at Cole's position. Without thinking, she pushed the loaded rifle through a small crack in the log wall, aimed at the dark shape, and pulled the trigger. The kick of the rifle slammed into her shoulder, and a cry of pain and surprise from outside told her she had found her mark. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The burning barn cast long, dancing shadows, turning the small valley into a vision of hell. 2 more of the bounty hunters fell to Cole's unerring aim, but there were too many. Ben Carter and the last man were circling, pinning him down. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the fire and the crack of the guns, a low, pained grunt from the direction of the well. Cole's rifle fell silent. "Cole!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. There was no answer. The gunfire stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the flames. A profound, terrible silence settled over the yard. Ben Carter and the last man, seeing their chance, began to advance on the cabin, but Evelyn was no longer there. She had unbarred the door and was running, heedless of the danger, toward the well. She found him slumped against the stone wall, his rifle in the dirt beside him. There was a dark, spreading stain on his chest, a wound that was too high, too central, to be survived. His eyes were open, and they found hers in the flickering firelight. He tried to smile, a weak, painful twisting of his lips. "You were supposed to stay inside," he rasped, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. Behind her, she heard the footsteps of the 2 remaining men. She knelt beside Cole, turning her back to them, shielding him with her own body. She did not care about them anymore. She did not care about anything but the fading light in Cole's eyes. "It is over, lady," Ben Carter's voice snarled from behind her. "Your protector is done for. Now you are coming with us." She ignored him. Her entire world narrowed to Cole's face. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear. "I love you," she whispered. The words she had been too afraid to say, now spoken in the face of their final, terrible ending. A faint light flickered in his eyes. He raised a trembling hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. "Knew it," he breathed. And then, from the ridge above them, a single shot rang out. Ben Carter grunted, a sound of final surprise, and collapsed to the ground. The last bounty hunter, stunned, looked up toward the ridge, and a second shot took him down. Sheriff Davis appeared on the ridge, a smoking rifle in his hand. He had followed them. He had watched over them. He was too late. Dawn was breaking, a thin, gray light filtering into the valley. The barn was a smoldering ruin, the bodies of the bounty hunters dark shapes in the yard. The world was quiet again. Evelyn held Cole in her arms, rocking him gently, his head cradled in her lap. The life was fading from him, his breathing shallow and ragged. She could feel the last of his warmth seeping away into the cold morning air. "I have never felt anything like this," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word, tears finally streaming down her face, tracing paths through the soot and grime. She was not talking about the grief, the despair. She was talking about the love, a love so vast and so real it was a physical agony in her chest, a love that made the prospect of a world without him an unbearable, unthinkable void. He managed a faint, final smile, his eyes fixed on her face. "Keep riding, west, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a bare thread of sound. "Do not stop." His hand fell from her cheek. His eyes went vacant, staring past her at the dawning sky. And then he was still. She held him as the sun rose, its golden light washing over the carnage of the night, over the smoking ruins of their dream. She held him until his body grew cold in her arms, the silence of his absence a deafening roar in her ears. She buried him on the small hill that overlooked their valley, the place where they had watched the sunsets. Sheriff Davis helped her dig the grave, his face a mask of weary sorrow. They worked in silence, the scrape of the shovels on the rocky earth the only sound. She wrapped him in his bedroll, his body now just a thing, a hollow shell that had once held the man she loved. She placed him in the earth and covered him over, her own hands pushing the dirt, the finality of the act a physical blow that left her breathless. She did not mark the grave with a cross. Instead, she took his worn, sweat-stained hat, the one he had always worn pulled low over his eyes, and placed it on the mound of fresh earth. It was all that was left of him. Days later, she rode out of the valley alone. Sheriff Davis had offered to take her back to civilization, to protect her, but she had refused. The world of men held nothing for her now. Her eyes were dry, her heart a burning coal in her chest. She rode west, as he had told her to. The horizon shimmered in the distance, a wavering line of heat that looked like hope she could almost touch, or a mirage that would vanish as she drew near. The land stretched endlessly before her, harsh, empty, and alive. It was a reflection of her grief, a vast and lonely space that was nevertheless teeming with a fierce, stubborn will to survive. It was like love itself, she thought, a thing of terrible beauty that could strip you bare and leave you for dead, and yet, somehow, leave you more alive than you had ever been before. The story closes on her silhouette against the rising sun, a solitary rider in an immense land, a whisper, carried on the cold morning wind, echoes across the empty plains, a final, quiet truth spoken to the man who was now a part of the earth beneath her. You saved me from more than the storm. Cole, you saved me from myself. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.